Mike Jacobson, Barbara Rabin, Chief Education Officer here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. And I would like to thank you for joining us for the fourth installment of our 2021 Summer Survivor Speaker Series. Today, you will hear from Mr. Mark Jacobs, a second-generation survivor whose father, Michael Jacobs, born as Mendel Jakubowicz, survived the Holocaust and went on to help found the Dallas Memorial Center for Holocaust Studies, the precursor of today's museum. Mark will share his father's experiences with you this afternoon. Born in Konin, Poland in 1925, Mike and his family were transported to and confined in the Ostrowiec Ghetto in 1940-41. More than 60 members of his family, including his parents, 2 brothers, 2 sisters, were murdered at Treblinka, death camp. Mike survived several camps, including Auschwitz, before being liberated from Mathausen-Gusen by the U.S. Army in 1945. Before we begin, I would like to thank our community partners for the Summer Survivor Speaker Series. These partners include Cristo Rey Dallas, Jewish Family Service of Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Mosaic Family Service, Refugee Services of Texas, Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. We are grateful for your support. Without it, this program would not be possible. Mark will share his father's story with you, and then we will have time for questions and answers. To ask him a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It's a little icon there, and type in your question. And now I would like to welcome Mark.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'd like to welcome everybody to hear my father's story. Just want everybody to know my father was one of the founders of the Dallas Holocaust Museum, and prior to that, the Dallas Survivors Group. And one of his dreams was to build a museum and a memorial to those who died in the Holocaust. And here we are in this great facility. And he would just love being here, and he just would love this building. Unfortunately, he passed away before it was completed. But to him, it was just wonderful for people to hear his testimony, to hear other survivors' testimonies, and for people to be educated about the Holocaust. My father was born in Konin, Poland in 1924, actually. We found out later on that instead of being born in 25, he was born in 24. And this is his family tree a little bit. I'm Mark Jacobs. I'm his eldest son. I was born in 1956. I have a sister and 2 brothers who are younger than me, and that's what makes us a second generation. My father, Mendel Jakubowicz, when he was born, married my mother, Ginger Jacobs, in 1953, and my father's parents were Moshe, and my Hebrew name is Moshe, so I'm named after my grandfather. My middle name is Edward, and I was named after a brother of my father who died before my father was born. His mother, my father's mother, was Dora Jakubowicz, and my sister's name is Devora, and she's named after our grandmother, my father's mother. And my 2 brothers are also named after brothers of my father. Everybody in his immediate family died in the Holocaust. So my father was, as we were saying, the driving force before in the founding of the museum. It was really his dream. From a very young age, we heard about my father's story. And then as the survivor group got started in the late 70s, we heard about the dream of building a Holocaust museum. And as you can see, that's my father, and Sam Zor, which was another one of the survivors who was very active at the beginning, Jack Altman, and Max Glauben. And Max Glauben is still alive and speaking as well. He's in his 90s. And then many of you will recognize Elie Wiesel. And my father was showing the plans of the museum to Mr. Wiesel when he was visiting Dallas. The original center was in the ground floor of the Jewish Community Center on North Haven. And as people entered the center, you came to these gates and the memorial room. And we have recreated that on a much bigger scale in this current building. And here is the boxcar, which we also have in the current building, coming to the Memorial Center just prior to it being built. And I'm going to have my father now talk a little bit about the founding of the museum.
And I always said to myself in camp that one day I'm going to be free. And the time will come. I will try to build a center, not a memorial stone, but a center that people can come, learn from the past, to look into the future. It should never happen again. As children, young or old, can come to the center and touch it and feel it and walk out and see what one human could do to the other. My speaking to you over here or sharing my experience, it's not for me. I went through. It's for the future generations, that they can listen and look at it, look at a living survivor, because I'm not going to be over here all the time. Someday I will have to go. They can say, yes, that's a survivor. He's telling the story. What one human could do to the other should never let it happen again. That's my children, my grandchildren, my grandchildren should not go through the horrors and should be left to see what the parents or the grandparents should go through. As they should not go out from this Memorial Center for Holocaust Studies in Dallas.
My father, as I mentioned earlier, was born in Konin, Poland. Konin is halfway between Warsaw and Berlin, Germany. And it was a small town, only about 10,000 people. The population, the Jewish population of Konin was about 30%. So there were quite a few Jews in the town. They were a very tight community. And here are some pictures of Konin back then. My father had many relatives. He had his parents, of course, and his siblings, but there were uncles and aunts and cousins who lived in Konin and also lived in some of the surrounding small towns to Konin. And he basically had a pretty normal childhood. He was the youngest of 6 children. He, of course, was very spoiled. He went to school, he played. He took each of one of myself and my siblings to Poland on trips back in the 80s. And we got to see Konin, and we got to see it through his eyes. And he just lit up when we were in Konin because those were good memories for him. He took us to the park and the oak tree that they used to play around, the river that they used to swim in, all the buildings that they used to play in. And when he would talk about it, you could tell that his childhood was a pretty happy childhood, surrounded by his family and friends. And of course, later on, it changed forever. So this is his family. His parents, his brothers, his sister. Unfortunately, he was never able to find any pictures of his parents, but you do have his siblings here. And it's really kind of interesting because this picture here, the girl in the lower right is my niece, Sarah, and she looks exactly like her. And then above her is another relative, and she looks exactly like one of my nieces, Lisa. It's really, really uncanny. His family was not well-to-do. They worked hard. His brothers were going to be tailors. I think my father probably would have been a tailor. And my dad is going to talk a little bit about his family.
Our city, as I mentioned before, they were all hard-working families. My family was working pretty hard to make a living. My father, had to work very hard to support, 6 children. Okay, till in 1935, if I'm correct, my brother became a master tailor. Let me explain to you what a master tailor is. He had to go to a special school to get a diploma that he can keep, apprentices and to teach them to be tailors. At this time, we already did a little better living in our city. I remember, that it was times, that we at night you didn't have any more bread because it's not like over here you came into a home, you had enough bread, you cut as much as you want. Over there you had your slice or 2 slices of bread in the morning and lunch, and you came home for supper, the same thing. You had to wait for next day to have you other meal. because it was a very hard living, but we always had enough meat on the table. Friday night, we had a nice Shabbos, in the afternoon, we had our cholent, and other things, we were a very, very close family, very, very close family.
On September 1st, 1939, my father's life changed. Nazi Germany invaded Poland and quickly moved across the country. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had signed a pact which allowed Germany to invade from the west and the Soviet Union to invade from the east. And my father at that time was 13, 14 years old. And all of a sudden the German army comes invading his hometown. He speaks about how they came and invaded the synagogue, which is our house of worship, took out the prayer books and the scrolls that we read the Torah from, very holy. He speaks about what it was like with curfews and arresting people and how it appeared to a 13, 14-year-old boy. And now he's going to talk a little bit about what the invasion was like.
1939, when the Nazis marched into our city, the first thing they did, they put a curfew. The Jewish people were not allowed to walk out from their homes from 6 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning, and the non-Jewish people from 9 o'clock till 6 o'clock in the morning. They took hostages, Jewish people and non-Jewish people. They put them to jail. They took also all the intelligentsia, the teachers. They brought them up to the Jewish cemetery, and they were shot. 99% non-Jewish teachers went into our beautiful ancient synagogue. They took out all the prayer books, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the prayer shawls, and all the religious memorabilia, and they put it into the square. After they emptied everything from the synagogue, they made a horse stable.
So life continued on very, very closed in, as you might imagine, as my father was describing. And eventually, the Nazis decided to clear out Konin and many of the cities around and move everybody to a ghetto called Ostrowiec. And everybody was called to the town square. They were marched to the trains, packed 75 to 100 people, and they traveled for 3 days and 3 nights to their new destination, where they would call home, what they would call home. And in Ostrowiec, there were people not only from Konin there, but from many towns from around the area, and many families packed into 1 room or 2 rooms or 3 rooms, very, very closed in. Much of a big change from what my dad was used to. Fortunately, he was able to blend in very well. He was able to kind of come and go. My dad was very street smart, and he knew how to work the system. And he would get out and help his family get food and help other people survive. It was really wonderful to hear him tell his stories. And I'm going to let him talk about the ghetto a little bit.
We came into Ostrowiec. I remember Jewish people were waiting over there from the city, and we went into a big school in front over there. They tried to put us in different homes, And I remember they put us in a home, 2 little small rooms, 16 people, 3 families. Our family consists of 8, and my future brother-in-law, and some other 2 families. Aunt of mine with the 2 daughters, and another, my future sister-in-law with the family over there, because we were staying together. And the rest of my family, my relatives, were staying in different homes. And that was the ghetto. People died of hunger, of sickness. I remember, as a small boy, I still did not believe what's going to happen.
When I went with my father to Poland, my mother was also with us. we went to Ostrowiec for the first time. My father had been to Poland several times before the trip that he took me. And we were walking on the streets of Ostrowiec, and he kept saying not very nice things about his experience there. Beforehand, he had great memories of Konin. He was very happy to be in Konin. He hated being in Ostrowiec. It was a very, very difficult life for everybody there. As he said, no food, no water. It was a huge struggle. People were dying all the time around him. And remember, he's a young boy. He's 13, 14 years old, maybe 15 years old during this time. And this is what he's seeing every day. And every day you're living in fear because you never know what's going to happen to you. There was finally, the Nazis decided, the Germans decided to empty out the Konin ghetto. And again, there was another boxcar ride. And his family was put on a boxcar to Treblinka, which was a death camp. And he was able to not be on the boxcar. In one of the boxcars, he was able to not be transported to his death, but his whole family did, and was transported. And he did not know that that was happening at the time. Instead, he was put into a smaller ghetto, and he became basically a slave laborer, emptying out the apartments of the belongings from the people who were sent to Treblinka. And now he's going to talk about being separated from his family.
And when we went to the big square, I took a look to my left, and I see they're selecting people over there. At this time, I saw to my older brother, next to me. I said, "Come on with me. I'm not going to go to the square." He said, "Come on." I grabbed him by the hand and I said goodbye to my parents and relatives, the dark faces, the sad faces, could never see, screaming and yelling people, pushing and everything, not knowing what's going on. And I came to this selection that tried to push me in with my brother back over there. They didn't want it to go over there. I sneaked through. As I sneaked through, they put us in a small little street, in a small little place. We were waiting. And later we marched in. And don't know where my parents went. They went through the same thing. They went into the boxcars and they traveled. And later on, I found out they went to Treblinka. As you know, Treblinka was a camp of no return. But that's what I was told. Between 700,000 or 800,000 people died over there. They went right away to the gas chambers, the crematoriums. There was a camp of, that's where they went. That's where the most people went, from Ostrowiec, Radom, around the vicinity.
You mean your mother and father went to Treblinka?
Yeah, all of my relatives, my brothers and sisters. Yes, except one brother who died in the partisan.
Except for you and your brother that separated yourself out from the family.
That's correct.
When you separated yourself out from the family, did you say anything to your own family about why you were separating yourself out?
Nothing. You see, you have to make quick decision. They do not know. They say goodbye. I waved goodbye to them. I moved away, right? Quick, not saying what I'm going or not.
What made you think that that was the thing to do?
I don't know, some intuition or something, but a drive not to go, because I was afraid if I'm going to go to the square, I didn't want to go away anymore, be transported or do something. I don't know what the other group was selected to. Took a chance.
So my dad stayed in the ghetto for a little while, helping to empty out the apartments, doing everything he could to survive. Eventually, though, he was deported to Auschwitz Birkenau. And many of you have heard about those camps. Auschwitz was was the main camp, and Birkenau was considered the death camp. And it's very, huge camp facility. Again, we went to visit those camps, and my father, of course, was walking around, remembering what it was like, telling us what it was like for him, what he did, what everyday life was like. And it was really it was difficult to see this and to hear this, because now it's a museum and now the grass is green. And back then, of course, it was not. There was no grass. And it just was such a contrast to what it must have been like when he was there. So Auschwitz is 15 square miles, and the size of downtown Dallas is only 1.4 square miles. So that gives you an idea of the scale of Auschwitz Birkenau. So my dad was selected to work, and he's now going to talk about his first impression of when he got to the camp.
To Birkenau, the boxcars opened, went down on the ramp, And we were waiting. As we were waiting, the orchestra was playing.
This was 1944.
44. The orchestra was playing. And I said to my friends, my God, take a look. We came into a paradise, clean, the orchestra is playing, welcoming us, everybody smiling and laughing. From the other side, you know, on the other side of the ramp was the women's camp, FL, the Frauenlager, what they used to call. Half a dozen women came out and they were waving about us, you know, smiling. I asked the prisoners over there, hey, what's going on? Where are we? The answer was a smile. Sure, they were not allowed. We were waiting. I looked to my right, and I saw smoke coming out from the chimneys. And I said to my friends, you know, when they ask me what profession I am, I say I'm a baker. You know, if I'm a baker and they select me, I work in a bakery, I will never go around hungry. Okay.
Well, he was selected to work, and he worked during his whole time there. And he'll talk about that in a little while. But the intake process was, he was given a uniform, he was given a tattoo, and for Auschwitz, you had an A plus a number. For Birkenau, he had a B. So my father had this tattoo on his arm, and he's going to talk a little bit about that right now. Oops.
We walked in to another camp, not knowing what the camp is all about, what we call the quarantine camp. As we walked into the quarantine camp, you were waiting, you had to stretch out your arm. As you stretched out your arm, they gave you a number, a tattoo number. They gave you the tattoo number. And as they gave me my tattoo number, B4990, the assessment came to me, and they says to me, do you know what this number all about? I said, no, sir. Okay, let me tell you now. You are being dehumanized. You a number. Still don't know what he was talking about. Okay, still don't know.
So he had the number on his arm, and he worked in a scrapyard, and which is rather ironic because later on when he came to Dallas, he owned a scrapyard. So you can say, you can almost say that he received his first training in the scrap business in the camps. The conditions, of course, in the camps were terrible. I don't think we can at all imagine what they were like. It was life and death every day. You never knew when you're going to be pulled out of line and shot. You never knew if you're going to die of starvation. But my father used to always tell us that he wasn't going to die. He always felt like he was going to live. And there was nothing that was going to kill him, except for, of course, you know, a German guard or something like that. But he wasn't going to let nature take its course. He was very optimistic about surviving. He always talked about how he was going to survive. He was always hopeful that he was going to survive. And one of the reasons why he felt like he had to survive was to tell his story. And here he's going, and he also was involved in the underground in the camp. And now he's going to talk a little bit about what life was like in the camp and how he survived.
How did I survive? I was a dreamer, a fantasizer. I tried to make myself human. Of course, they said I'm not. I saw birds flying into camp. I can see it right now. When I'm talking to you, I am in Birkenau, laying on the bunk. I could see birds flying in and picking on the ground. And I said to myself, what they can pick on the ground, we cannot see it. And they flew out. And I said, why can't I be a bird? And I said to myself, Mike, close your eyes and start to fantasize. I closed my eyes and I was a bird, and I flew out and I was free. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the same surrounding, but for the few moments when I was dreaming and fantasizing, I was a free person. I was free. I was somebody again. Did you ever see boxcars or railroad cars traveling on the rail? So nice and peacefully in different directions, nobody's telling them where you're going. They're pulled. Nobody's asking for an identification card, no nothing. And I said to myself, isn't it nice and quiet? Why can't I be a boxcar? I changed myself for a plank of wood, be part of the boxcar, and I was traveling again. I was free again. The most precious thing a person can have or can possess is to be free. Make no difference what you have, how rich and how the luxuries you have. When you're not free, you are nothing. Dreaming and fantasizing, make myself always reminding myself that I'm a person like anybody else, kept me going. And I always say, I never lost my hope, never lost my belief.
In early 1945, the Allies were moving in from the west. The Soviet Union was moving in from the east, and the Germans decided to evacuate Auschwitz Birkenau. And everybody who could do so went on a death march. Those who couldn't do so stayed in the camps, and they were eventually liberated by the Soviet Red Army. My father was still relatively healthy and was on one of these death marches. And essentially they were marched in the snow. We live in Dallas and we know what our winters are like. We also had a real taste of what winter really could be like back in February this year. Well, in Poland, winters are really, really harsh. And this is in January. So my father was on a death march, and they traveled in a boxcar for days, and he wound up in a camp called Mudhausen, and he's going to talk about the death march.
January the 18th, 1945, the Russian army are closing in. They stopped 40 kilometers, 27 miles from Auschwitz. They could walk in with one tank and liberate us. They gathered us in Auschwitz, 1 o'clock in the morning of the 19th. They took us out. We marching in snow, cold, 35 kilometers a day, no food, no water. I had plenty of water, snow. We marching, not know where we're going. People what could not make it, I can see it now, the people, they're staring at me. Because they fall back, they lost their wooden shoes in the deep snow, or they couldn't make it, they fall back. They were shot, not with a regular bullet, but with a dum-dum bullet, with a shadow bullet. If the person gets shot in their head, the head will split in dozens of pieces. The side of the roads, you can see it now, was not white. Everything was red.
My father wound up in the camp called Mathausen, which was in Austria. It was also a major concentration camp. And he was put in a subcamp called Gusen II, just a couple of miles away from the subcamp, from the main camp Mudhausen. He was working, again, slave labor. They had hollowed out a mountain nearby and they were building airplanes. Many of the inmates at Mudhausen died. Over 90,000 died, and 14,000 of the people who died there were Jewish. So when he was working, he was also involved in the underground sabotaging airplanes. And here he is talking about being in Gusen II.
That took me down to Gusen. It was a small camp of 7,500 people. Every day used to bring up a transport of 1,000 or 1,500 people. Every day was the same amount of people. People died, new people came in. And they put me in to work in a factory building Messerschmitt planes. You know, the big Jaeger planes. And the factories were built already in the big mountains. Every day we used to get packed in the railroad cars, and we used to travel, it was too far to travel, they brought us back. I built a part in the plane, what we call the shot fender. It was a small little round piece, you know, you had to weld it, you know, electric welding, and I had to make nice 3 holes. Exactly had to be the 3 holes, because every time it was checked out to the 10th of a millimeter, until the 3 holes, the 3 wires went back, for the pilot used to control the flaps in the back, slow it down and everything. But being in the underground, I said they're not going to get away with nothing. I was pretty fast to mix up things. The plane went up, the plane came down. They didn't know what happened. They thought there's something wrong with aluminum. They used to come and try to test aluminum. That's what I used to do to the last minute, till May the 5th, 1945. My friends, when I go to Israel or they're in Europe or someplace in the United States or with me in camp, they don't call me Mike. They call me partisan. They call me partisan. Everybody will call me partisaner. See, they're calling me by this name because they know, my friends, my friend might know that what I was doing.
So as you can see, my father really tried hard to survive, and he helped others survive as well. He would organize food. He would work in the underground. He did whatever he could to resist the Germans and the Nazis, and he did whatever he could to survive. Finally, in May 1945, the camp was liberated. And what do? He's been basically under the thumb of Nazi Germany since September 1939, and here it is, May 1945. All his teenage years were spent in camps or ghettos, fearing for his life. Now he's going to talk about what it was like being liberated.
I say, okay, I go out, and I waved to the tank. A guy comes out from the turret, and I'm scared, comes out from the turret. He threw in a small little bar. I picked up was a bar of chocolate. I grabbed it, I went into the barrack, and I said, take a look. Can you imagine? They named this little chocolate Herschel. I couldn't spell the name Herschel. I said, Herschel, okay? It was delicious. It was delicious. And I looked out again to the window, and now we have a guy, a civilian with a red crossband, with a soldier with a machine gun, and he waves, and everybody's scared to go to the fence. I say, okay, I'm going to go. I went to the fence. The guy tells me in German, you are free now. The Americans are over here. And stay in this camp. Wait over here. We're going to take you back to the main camp of Mauthausen. We're going to give you food and clothing. They told me I'm free. I was waiting for 5.5 years to hear this beautiful song, the beautiful melody that I'm free. I'm walking out from this camp. No camps for me anymore. Finally decided, next day we walked out from this camp. As I walked out on the other side of the barbed wire, I stopped and I looked. Nobody's waiting for me. Nobody's welcoming me. Where do I go? I have no home to go home. And at this time I said to myself, Mike, don't you ever look back. Think positive and keep going. I kept going, went into Linz. And that's when I was liberated by the Americans, May the 5th, 1945.
So 2 quick stories. The Herschel bar, of course, was Hershey chocolate. And one of the liberators became very close to my parents in subsequent years. And every year around May 5th, my dad would receive a bag of Hershey's Kisses to remind him and remind Harry Schaefer was his name, about that wonderful day in my father's life. He was always very, very fond of the people who liberated him. He was very grateful. He always talked about them. And props to all the liberators. Another thing, when we went back to Poland, we went to Mudhausen, and we were driving along, and I looked over to the left, and I saw something that looked like a camp gate. And we went over to it, and it turns out that was the camp gate for Gusen II. So we drove up to it, and my mother and my father got out, and they went behind the gate. And then my father walked out, and he had such a big smile on his face because he was able to relive the moment that he was liberated from the tyranny that he'd lived under for 5.5 years. Well, after he was liberated, he went to Mittenwald, which is on the other side in Germany, and he lived there for about 6 years. And this is a picture of my father when he was on the train leaving Germany for Hamburg, and he came to New Orleans. And he settled in Dallas, of all places. Why Dallas? Because when he was getting his final papers, one of the people who he was being checked out by said that he should go to Dallas because it's the land of opportunity. You would be able to make something of yourself. There aren't that many people there. So my dad said, sure. So he came to Dallas and started his life all over again. He didn't know how to speak English. He was very, very entrepreneurial. He worked, he met my mother, and he's going to talk about coming to Dallas. And by the way, that's his naturalization certificate when he became a citizen in 1957. And as you see, he had a flat top. People used to laugh about that. It was kind of funny. And then here's my father sitting at his desk at his office. No, I'm sorry. He was sitting here signing books.
At this time, I said to myself, I will never stop talking. If people want to listen to me or not. I have two people. If they listen for 5 minutes, they walk away, I accomplish 5 minutes. And I never stopped because it's very close to me. Again, that people should know about it. This generations and generations to come should never happen again. I don't want the people here in the United States, what they say was no Holocaust. Hundreds of books are written about was no Holocaust. The Holocaust is a hoax. Auschwitz is a myth. Was never Auschwitz. Those people, when they come out and tell this story or write about the Holocaust was no Holocaust, was a hoax. These are the most dangerous people walking in this United States because those people want you and the future generation to believe that was not happening, that was not true. And again, these people be caught off guard. God forbid if those people get the power, they will do exactly the same thing, maybe worse. We must know, we must remember, we must not forget. We must always say in our mind, it can happen again. We must not be indifferent.
So my father married in 1953, as I said. He had 4 children. My sister had 4 daughters, has 4 daughters still. And here are pictures of our family. This is from the 80s. This is probably the 2000s. There is myself and my youngest brother with a couple of the grandkids. And then here are all the nieces with their children at that time. So there are 5 here, but now my sister has 8 grandchildren. There was a grandson born in, a great grandson actually of my father, born in December, and another one born in January. My father was able to hold his first great grandchild before he passed away. So my father spent a lot of time, spent all his retirement years speaking to groups, churches, schools, coming here to speak to people. That was his mission, to educate people about the Holocaust. Unfortunately, he passed away in July 2014. As a matter of fact, according to the Hebrew calendar, the anniversary of his death starts this Friday night and into Saturday. We go by the lunar calendar. So I will be going to synagogue to say a special prayer in memory of my father. His legacy lives on through his family, through the family. My niece Rivka is very active in the Jewish community. I'm active in the Jewish community. We all were very committed to my father's mission. My mother was a wonderful partner with my father in going around to speak to groups, and she passed away, unfortunately, in 2016. The picture that you saw of my father sitting at that desk was taken probably the week before he passed away. So he was here all the way up to the end, talking about his experiences, educating people. And I'd like to add, there's a lot more anti-Semitism now than there had been in past years, and it's really become a problem. And it's up to us to fight anti-Semitism. And that's one of the missions of the Holocaust Museum. Everybody needs to be an upstander. Everybody needs to tell people that anti-Semitism is evil. It's a sin. Everybody needs to remind people that the Holocaust did happen. And we have to keep talking, we have to keep educating people, and we have to remember people like my father who helped build this wonderful museum. And we look forward to all of your support, and we hope that you'll be able to come visit. And thank you, and we will start taking some questions.
Thank you so much, Mark, as always, for sharing your father's incredible story. We do have some questions. Again, if you have additional questions, please go ahead and use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. But we'll start with this one. Do you know, you mentioned when your father was and his family were in the ghetto that he was able to get in and out, smuggle food in. Do you know anything about how he managed to do that?
He was pretty, yes, I think when he was a kid, he was very kind of blonde-haired, light-haired, and blue-eyed and slender, and he just was able to sneak in and out of the ghetto. Sometimes I think he may have paid a few bribes. He would go out into the countryside and gather potatoes and fruit and other vegetables and bring them in. But he was a pretty sly little guy, and he was able to sneak in and out. And fortunately, he never got caught. There were a couple times that it was very, very close, and he always knew how dangerous it was, but he managed. He managed.
Very resourceful. We have another question about your father's kind of underground activities. You talked some about what he did or he talked, I guess, about what he did at Gusen II. Do you know if he was involved in any underground or resistance activities when he was at Birkenau?
Yes. There was a big underground presence in Auschwitz Birkenau. And if some of you remember, there was an attempt to break out, and it happened a little bit prematurely. It didn't go quite as planned. And my father was involved in some of the preparations for that. He did not try to escape. And of course, he was able to live through that. A lot of people were able to escape, some of whom wound up getting killed. But he did his best to support the underground and what they were doing.
Our next question is about what your dad was like when you were growing up. Did he share these experiences with you when you were young, or did it take a while for him to open up and talk about this? What was that like?
He always spoke about his experiences. It's something that we grew up with, unlike a lot of survivors who never spoke about it, or who didn't speak about it until they were older, or kids who were told not to ask their fathers or mothers about their experiences. My father was always very, very open. So we knew about everything that happened to him from a very, very young age. And of course, he was always speaking. He was going off and speaking to schools. We would be around the dinner table with friends, and he would talk about his experiences. So it was really very much so a part of our upbringing. It was very sad to hear the stories, but it was also in some ways uplifting because of how he had survived. And also it gave us a sense of what his family was like. It gave us an opportunity to know our relatives who settled in Israel, settled in South Africa and Canada. And it also gave us an opportunity to know the other survivors in Dallas who we were close to. So yes, we grew up with it. Thank goodness.
Yeah, and you mentioned that your father had been back to Poland several times. Do you know what that first trip back was like for him? What inspired him to go back? What was he feeling when he went through that? I'm not sure how old you were when that happened.
We never thought that he'd ever go back to Poland. It was something like he just couldn't do it. But in like 1976, I think, he was able to go on a mission to Poland. At that time, I was in college. I went to Brandeis University, and we were just shocked that he decided to go. So he went with my mother on this mission, and they were able to go back to Konin, his hometown. They were able to go to the camps. They visited Treblinka, and it was very, very freeing for him. He told the story, and my mother tells this story, that when they were in Birkenau, he walked up to one of the fences. And back then, of course, it was electrocuted. And a lot of people committed suicide by grabbing the barbed wire. And mother says that my dad went up to one of the fences, and he put his hand around the barbed wire, and he let it go, and he started saying that he was free. He was free. And it was like amazing, the change in him, because it told us that even through all those years until 1976, and that's 30 years since he was liberated, that he never felt really free. And one of the things that happened when he came back from this trip is that he went out, unbeknownst to my mother, and bought a new house. And basically, this was the house for my mother and for himself, and he was going to really enjoy being free. So that first trip back to Poland was very, very liberating for him emotionally. And after that, I would say that he probably made maybe 7, 8, 9 trips back to Poland, and every trip was very mixed emotionally. On the one hand, he was going back to the place of his childhood, which was very happy. On the other hand, it was also the killing ground for his family.
Absolutely. We have another question about what happened to your father's brother. So the brother that he stayed behind with in the ghetto.
The brother who stayed behind with him eventually joined the underground, the partisans, and he fought as a partisan. And unfortunately, some of these partisan groups fought against each other. And one of these partisan groups eventually killed his brother. So he didn't die at the hand of the Germans, he died at the hands of a fellow Pole. And some of this had to do with these partisan groups being anti-Semitic. You know, let's face it. There were people who were anti-Semitic and they didn't like the Jewish partisans. So they went after them. My father found out about this much later on.
Another question, sort of an interesting question about if any relationships were formed when he was going through these camps, but did he ever reunite with anyone he knew in the camps? Did he build relationships during that time? Do you know anything about that?
Yes. He went through the camps with one of his best friends from growing up. His name was Leon Brzezinski, and they survived together and they went off. Leon eventually settled in the States in New Jersey, and he worked in New York. And we were very close to him while he was still alive. And they actually went back to Poland together much later on. I think there were some other people who he kind of knew. You know, everybody kind of looked the same because of the uniforms, and even though they were close in camp, some of them you'd really lost touch with. But after the war, when he was in Mittenwald, he became very close to a bunch of people, and after they came to the United States and they used to visit each other, and some of the survivors from Conan he visited with after the war, and some of these people I knew growing up as well, but most of them unfortunately have passed away in the last number of years.
Looks like we just have one more question for you, Mark. What inspired you to start telling your father's story? When did this journey start for you? What was it like putting this presentation together?
Oh, wow. Well, having grown up with it, I kind of knew that this was something that I always wanted to do. My father spoke. It was really interesting to hear him speak. It was always very moving. I think all of you probably noticed how I was looking back at him speaking, and it's like, wow, there he is. So I just think it's important to carry on his legacy. And I think he would be very pleased at all the second generation who are speaking, because it's up to us now. And I do it because I think I love doing it. Preparing this, as you can see, can be kind of emotional.
Well, I lied to you. We've got a couple more questions that
Okay.
just came in. If you're okay,
I'm
keep going
okay.
just for a little bit. So Amanda asked if your children and grandchildren have started to share his story in any capacity, or are you kind of the flag bearer for the family right now?
Right now, I'm the main one who does it, but my nieces all talk about it. They're very proud of my father. They're all very happy to talk about his experiences with their friends. He wrote a memoir called Holocaust Survivor, and it's available on Amazon and here at the museum. And they're all spoken about in there. So they also talk about his experiences, and they're upstanders. They really want everybody to know what happened and to understand what the museum is all about and what our obligations are to our people, to our surviving parents and grandparents.
Wonderful. We have another question about how your parents met.
Yes, it's a great story. Back in those days, there still is, but there was a Jewish community center that was in South Dallas at the time, and my mother was a phys ed major, and my father was teaching gymnastics and exercises, things like that. And somebody came and got my mother, and they said, "Hey, you need to come over and meet this guy. He's just come over here from Germany, and he really knows how to run this class. And I think it'd be really interesting for you to meet him." And so she came over and she saw my dad teaching this class. As you can see, he was very athletic. He was a soccer referee and played soccer, and he was refereeing soccer games into his 60s. And that's how they met. And I'm sure it must have been very interesting because you heard his accent, and I don't hear it as heavily as everybody else does, but you can only imagine what it must have been like back in 1953 when they first met. So they dated and they got married, and they had a wonderful life together.
I think we'll end on this next question. I think it's a great one to end on. If you could guess, if your father was still with us speaking to young people today, what do you think he would tell them?
He would tell them that they should continue to have hope, and have belief and to stand up for themselves and to be upstanders, to fight prejudice in any form. He would tell them that they can accomplish what they want to accomplish, that it doesn't have to just be a dream. Sometimes it's difficult, but it's also very rewarding. He would tell them that we live in a wonderful country. It gave him a second life. And he would also tell them that, we certainly have our problems, but it's up to us to try and solve them and to help our country live up to its great ideals. And he would also tell them that life is good.
I think that's a great spot to end on. Thank you again, Mark, for sharing your dad's story, for continuing to share his legacy. We appreciate it as always. Thank you everyone for watching this afternoon. Again, the series runs every Tuesday through August 10th. So we hope you'll join us for future sessions. But until then, have a great day and we'll see you next time. Thank you.